Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Erik Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the very first book from my list of 200 great books. Well, I spent the first 2 months of this year, 2023, reading straight through the Bible, and so it is still at the forefront of my mind, and something stuck out to me immediately from the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is a flood story in Gilgamesh, and it was written 1,000 years before the flood story we know of as Noah's Ark. Now that threw me for a loop. That one, I was not expecting that. I mean, I had heard that there were other flood stories, that there were, that the flood, the deluge showed up in other myths. But I guess what I didn't realize is that it would show up in one that was 1,000 years before the account in the Bible. And also that there was one that was so similar to what we see in the Bible. I mean, they're at the end of the time in the boat. They send out birds in the Epic of Gilgamesh to look for dry land, very similar to what we find in the Noah's Ark account. So this brought up some questions and just made me wonder about things like, is the Noah story just a mere copy of an older story? And if it is, does that diminish it at all? Or did the flood happen in multiple places? And if so, how was it that there were people that were saved from each area in some sort of a boat? It just kind of got my mind going, and in a fun way. And so last night I ran the first discussion group for this new phase of the Books of Titans reading project. And there were 4 of us, and we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Dr. Jason Staples was on that call, and he said a few very helpful things in relation to this story in the deluge, the flood story. So the first thing he said is that we're talking about Mesopotamia here. And this is an area that a lot of it's between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so these rivers, they would have flooded, and this would have been a potentially a regular occurrence for people living in this area. So devastating flooding would have likely been in the consciousness of these people. So whether or not there was a huge flood that covered an enormous area or the entire world, whether that's the case or not, what is more likely is that anyone living in this area would be very familiar with a flood. So it would probably come out in stories. So that's just one thing. The next thing he said is that instead of the story in the Bible, the account of the flood, instead of that being a copy of the story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it could instead be the offering of a counter narrative. So same story, same flood, but vastly different results, vastly different ramifications for that flood. So Dr. Staples was saying that the Bible writers would have known this story. They would have known the Epic of Gilgamesh. And from the tablets that we found, we have over 73 tablets of this story that we know of. I guess there's so many tablets that they just haven't even had time to go through all of them yet. But they're in museums. A lot of them are in the British Museum. There's some in museums here in the United States as well that contain this story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's all over the place in different areas within different empires at different times, and there are a number of variations of this story. So the key point here is that this was in the public consciousness. This story, this was well known, and so the biblical writers they probably took this story and just offered a different after story of it, the ramifications for this flood. And you can see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So yes, the flood stories are very similar, but the ramifications for those are quite different. So what is the Epic of Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh was a historic king of that area. He ruled in Uruk Uruk, and that's very close to which is where Abraham came from. So all very close in that area there. It's kind of the original hero's journey, or just a mythical journey of a man conquering a monster or battling a monster. Seeking a sage, seeking someone wise who can help him. But there are a number of differences from what we are accustomed to with the hero's journey. And usually in a hero's journey, the hero battles the monster, battles the dragon, and overcomes the dragon, and there's this huge victory in that. But what we see here in this case, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is that the battle against the monster, it actually doesn't end well. And perhaps Gilgamesh wasn't supposed to do that. And there's a lot of that kind of ambiguity in the story that makes for just a very rich story. It's not like this monster bad, Gilgamesh good, let's go kill monster, and then good guy beats bad guy. It's not like that. I mean, there's a lot wrong with Gilgamesh. He's a horrible king at the beginning of the book, and at the beginning of the story, and you're seeing these things that you kind of expect the story to maybe go this way. Well, he defeats the monster. He's going to be the hero, but that's not how it goes down. And so just a lot of neat parts of the story like that. This is one of the, if not the oldest stories that we have. 4,000 years old. I mean, that's it. It's so cool to think about that. I'll go into that a little bit more in the next segment, but yeah, the first thing that stuck out was just that connection to the Bible. There's other pieces as well where you'll notice a phrase like, for instance, here's a section in Tablet 5 where he says, "Though they may be weak, too," and then there's a part where there's missing text, but this idea that two will succeed, and then two triplets, a 3-ply rope is not easily broken. And that is very similar to Ecclesiastes 4:12, where, let me get that. And that says, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And some other translations of that have it more to that 3-ply statement. So that one stuck out as well. And it's kind of a neat idea of, I've heard that in the Wisdom of Solomon or the Proverbs, that it was actually a collection of a lot of wise sayings just from around the area at that time. So kind of gets me excited about going deeper into this Great Books project. Like, will I come across more of these phrases that show up in books attributed to Solomon? It's kind of a neat thing to think about. So next segment, I'll go into one other thing that stuck out to me, and then I want to highlight the versions of this story that I read. One thing I thought was really neat in this story was just what you learn about the beliefs of that time period. So yes, there's a certain degree where it's just you're reading a story. There's common elements. There's action, there's dialogue, there's all of that. But within that, you're learning something about the beliefs of that culture. I guess in the sense that if we were to watch a movie, there are just things embedded in there that are part of our culture. Like, we don't even think about them, we don't question them. They're just in there. Like it's not a shock to us. And so here are a few ideas that stuck out as I was reading this story. And some of these are just very basic, but we're talking about a book that's 4,000 years old. So just kind of the thinking about that, or a story that's that old, and thinking about that. And were people like vastly different? Did they believe just crazily vastly different things, or are there some similarities? So here are just 4 things that stuck out. There is this belief in a netherworld, a place you go after you die. So there's some sort of a life after death, and it's talked about as shades, like you're a shade of what you were. Yeah, it's not like clearly defined of what all is involved. And there is the netherworld. I didn't really get the sense that there was perhaps like a good netherworld and a bad netherworld. but there were degrees within that netherworld. There is a heaven spoken of, but that kind of seemed just more like the heavens of something above. A second thing here is just that there's a sense of staying in your place and in doing your duty. That's a strong idea that comes through the book. A third idea is that Gilgamesh can defy the gods. So the gods don't make people their playthings. And this gets a little tricky because we're told that Gilgamesh is 2/3 God, 1/3 man. And so maybe, the general person of the time is not going around defying the gods. But there is quite a bit of defying of the gods by both Gilgamesh and his friend. And the fourth thing that comes up is that the gods can make mistakes. So in that story of the flood, in the story of the deluge, they kill off mankind. There's a few people that make it in the boat, but in general, they've killed off mankind, and so now mankind cannot offer sacrifices. They cannot feed the gods, and so it kind of backfired. And there's just an assumption there that the gods cannot foresee that what would have happened, by killing everyone off with a flood, that would have had that bad ramifications for the gods themselves. So apparently there's limits to the gods of that they can't know things in the future, or perhaps they can, but just not in this circumstance. So I just found it fun to consider that while I'm reading the story and thinking of it. So in terms of the versions that I went with, I've read a couple and I've actually ordered a third. And here are some reasons why I did that. So first off, this was my very first time ever reading this story. And I was going to start with the Penguin Classics version that's translated by Andrew George. But when I started looking at it, it's not like a academic book, but it's more academic than the Stephen Mitchell translation that I saw. And I probably shouldn't use the word translation because Stephen Mitchell himself says it's not a translation, it's a version. And so what Stephen Mitchell says that he does is take English versions and kind of weave them together into a very nice version of Gilgamesh. And so what I did instead is I started with the Stephen Mitchell version and I just read it straight through. And it's very easy on the eyes. It's just, he did a great job of it. And so I read that before I read any notes, anything like that. I just wanted to read straight through the story and get the basic gist of what was happening in the story. So if you're in that same boat, if you have never read Gilgamesh, if you just want to understand the basics of the story, I would start with the Stephen Mitchell version of the book. Next, I read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Penguin Classics version, and this is the one that's translated by Andrew George. And so after reading the Stephen Mitchell one, I actually read the introduction from the Stephen Mitchell book just to get a better idea of what was going on. And then I read the introduction for the Andrew George version, and then I started reading the Andrew George translation. Now, the Andrew George translation is much more involved and it's much more scholarly in the sense that he is showing you where we're missing information. So whereas the Stephen Mitchell one is just the straight up, kind of storyline, the Andrew George version has brackets around the content where he kind of thinks this is what it says, or he's pulling that from other tablets or other parts of the story where it's similar wording. And then there'll be sections where there's like just this text we don't have, or we're missing 30 lines here. And so he just highlights that throughout. And so the text is very marked up and you get the gist of the story. And then at the beginning of each section, Andrew George is kind of telling you what is happening in that section. And so that's a really neat experience as well, because you're getting a deep dive. You're seeing what we do have of the story, what we don't have, where the clay tablets were broken or we just are missing it. And so that's really cool. And so the very first part after the introduction is the Epic of Gilgamesh. But then after that, there are like a number of additional stories about Gilgamesh that have been found on different tablets. And so he just goes through those, and it gives additional insight into the story, maybe some different versions of the stories. And so that's really neat as well. So if you want to take a deeper dive, you can do that with this Andrew George Penguin Classics version. And I will link to these all in the show notes. In that call yesterday where we discussed the Epic of Gilgamesh, Dr. Staples suggested one other version, and that is just another version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but this one is translated again from the original Akkadian language, which is what Andrew George did, translated it from that original language. This is a 2022 version done by Sophus Helle. I'm not sure on the pronunciation of the name, but I actually just ordered this one yesterday. It's going to arrive tomorrow, and I'm going to read this one as well. Hey, it's the first book of the Great Books project, and I want to go deep in this one, and I've really enjoyed reading it. So I'm going to go with this third translation as well. And if you follow me on social media or subscribe to the newsletter, I'll let you know what I thought of this one as well. But it goes by fast. I mean, you can read the Stephen Mitchell version in an hour and a half. So I figured I might as well get this third version. I'd love to read it again, see maybe some of the things that this person translated, how they translated it differently. So that'll be the next book on my list. As part of this reading project, as part of this Great Books part of the project, I'm also going to read what I'm calling a guidebook for each of the books. And so this guidebook could just be, help me better understand the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in a sense, I've gotten that from the Stephen Mitchell version in the introduction, and then also the introduction and tremendous guides within the text itself by Andrew George. There's also an introduction in this third book, but I'm going to read another book, and it's called Civilizations of Ancient Iraq. It's by Benjamin Foster and Karen Pollinger Foster. Now, this one was suggested, or it's in the bibliography for the Andrew George version. So that's where I heard about it, but it kind of just goes through the history of the land we know of as Iraq, in the civilizations there. So I'm really excited about this because I think it'll kind of tie in well with the Epic of Gilgamesh in the sense of here are the civilizations where this story was. I think it'll also help me just in reading the Bible in the sense of the people of Judah were exiled to the northern kingdom was exiled to Assyria, and the southern kingdom, Judah, was exiled to Babylon. So I'll learn about these civilizations. I'll learn what life was like there. I think that just kind of help in understanding what it would have been like to go from the promised land of Israel, what it would have been like to be in exile, to then go to Assyria and Babylon, and what were the beliefs, what was life like, what would it have been like for the people going there. Take a step back here really quickly, just also to describe the experience of reading this, because I just read the Epic of Gilgamesh. I started it on March 1st, and that was the very first time I ever read the book. So in terms of my expectations, I really expected it, since it is so old, I expected to not really understand a lot of it. I expected there to be a lot of just things that were just so foreign to my mind that I was just going to kind of slog my way through it. But from the start, I was enthralled. It is such a good story. It's such a deep story. It's not, perfect good guys over here, horrible, evil, bad guys over here, good guys defeat bad guys, end of story, happy, ever ending. No, it's not like that at all. It's a very deep story and a very good one. And so this is like why I read. This is why I like to read is for things like this and coming across stories like this. I mean, it just opened my mind to so many new ideas. It was exciting. I loved reading just the story first without having anyone else's thoughts of it in my head. Just show me the story, and then going deeper into these introductions and seeing how did this story come about? How did we get the story? We didn't get the story until the year 1850. It was lost for like 1,000 years. And they found these clay tablets. They started finding these in different archaeological excavations. And now we have a ton of them. And we've just had this story now for a little over 150 years. So that's another really cool part of it as well. This old story is rediscovered in a way. So I highly recommend you reading it. And if you do, start with the Stephen Mitchell version. If you want to go deeper, go with the Andrew George version, and then I'll let you know what I think of this new 2022 version as well. So in the next segment, I will cover my one key takeaway from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is how I have always ended my podcast episodes, because I find that if I can remember one thing from a book, it will help me to remember a lot more. And it's also, if I can remember that one thing, that's a good start in remembering what I've read. The one thing, my one key takeaway from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, one of the reasons I started this Great Books project is because I started seeing this idea that books come from books. And I could read one book that was it would take one part of another book and expand on it. But you keep pulling that thread, and it usually goes back to a book. And maybe that's not even the first book. Maybe it goes back further than that. But there are what are called these great books. There are books that have influenced many others. And you can read the books that were influenced by them, or you could read the book that started the influence. And so that's really one of the main reasons I'm doing this Great Books project and reading 200 books over the next 10 years, is because of that idea: books come from books. The idea that stories before the Bible influence the Bible and are potentially interacting with those stories, that is one of the most exciting ideas I've come across in a while. And that's my one thing from this book. It has me really excited. It's easy to see the Bible's influence across much of our literature, but to read some of these early texts and see how the biblical writers may have been referencing and addressing these stories is a whole new world to me. I guess I'd never thought of it before, that the biblical writers were referencing and then addressing and perhaps giving a different vantage point, a different view, a different takeaway from these stories that were so widespread. And that is just a really cool thing as I'll be reading some other books here that predate the writing of the Bible. And yes, that took place over many years, but I'm speaking directly in reference to the beginning part of the Bible. So I can't wait to dig into some of these other stories and see if I notice these connections, or maybe how a biblical writer might be taking a piece of a story and then giving a different view on it, or even referencing it just in itself. So to recap, the Epic of Gilgamesh was truly an epic. It is a fantastic story. It'll be hard for you to put it down. So much going on. So many neat things to think about after you read it. I do recommend trying to find someone else to read it with and talk to them about it after you've read it, because there's so many rabbit holes you can go down. There's so many things to discuss from this book. I'm nerding out. I'm reading 3 different versions of it, and then I'm going to read this ancillary book, Civilizations of Ancient Iraq, to understand even more the civilizations that were a part of this book, where we found these tablets and where this story would have been a big part of their lives. So that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you have read the Epic of Gilgamesh and you want to share maybe something you've gotten out of it. Just as part of this opening up the project to more of online discussions, I've started hearing from a lot more people, and it's been cool. There's some people that read Gilgamesh because of this project, and now they're going down these huge rabbit holes, reading articles, going into the archaeology of finding these tablets, and they're sending me what they're finding, and so they're sending me articles and videos, and it's really been a delight. So I hope you join in one of these upcoming discussions as well. I'm trying to get this information settled and kind of a schedule going out just on when I'll be doing the books. But the best place to start right now is just to look at the list of the great books and to start getting some of those, knowing that I'll probably have some discussions about those. And also knowing that you'll have some time to read them, because I'm going to be doing these guidebooks throughout as well. So you'll see the straight list, but I'll also be reading other books in between those. So they can give you some time to get these books and then to start reading them. So please subscribe to the newsletter, and I'll keep you updated there on what's going on with the project. Thank you for listening. I'll be back in a couple weeks to talk about another book from this Great Books project. And the book I may even talk about is that Civilizations of Ancient Iraq. I may just kind of share what I learned from that. I'll be back in a couple weeks. Thank you for listening.